Next guest is Dennis Matthew. Dennis is an elementary school speech pathologist, singer-songwriter, and author. For over 20 years, Dennis has had the joy and honor of working with children in public schools and through nonprofit work. In 2018, he launched his authorship, bringing children's stories, integrating social emotional wholeness, language enrichment, critical thinking, and conflict resolution and character development to life. His published works so far are Bello the Cello, My Wild First Days of School, and How Grizzly Found Gratitude. He's also a singer-songwriter with a published music album for schools called The Let's Roar Experience. Through his books and music, Dennis has reached tens of thousands of students worldwide since 2018. He eagerly looks forward to hearing from you to work with your school community to spread joy through story and song. Welcome to the podcast, Dennis.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
Yeah, so I think of the inception of my authorship would be a great example of being in a trench, emotionally and professionally at the time. I want to invite you to the summer of 2017, where I just kind of found myself in a dry spell, so to speak. Professionally, I'd kind of lost the joy of working in the education field. I don't know if the journey had kind of gotten monotonous and mundane. I don't know if that's what it was, that the routine of it all was just kind of getting to me.
Mhm.
And then on top of that, I also hit a time window where I was unemployed, so I could not find work as well. So it kind of came to a high pressure point in life where I had to provide for my family, and I found myself in a place in life where I never thought I'd find myself in. And that's
Mhm.
kind of where for lack of having anything else to do with my time, I decided to kind of put pen to paper and write this story that I had in my mind for over a decade.
Mhm.
Just a concept that I had about a little cello going to school and kind of discovering his song and his purpose. Kind of like I was wrestling with my own, song and purpose, and at that particular stage of my life. So that's
Mhm.
kind of where Bello the Cello found its origin, and that's definitely a hard point in my life when I look back, and it's definitely a
Mhm.
place in my life where I would say is a trench moment. So now where you're finding me is, I've been on my authorship journey for 4 years now, and coming up on some 50,000 books distributed of these little stories that I've written along the way. So
Mhm.
that what that low point in life kind of pushed me to do was to kind of find a regenesis of
Mhm.
sorts. And I'm in a place where I have found new joy, for working in the education field again. I feel like I have, a fresh wind, so to speak, under my wings
Mhm.
to kind of keep going for the next, hopefully 10 to 15 years or whatever. So I find myself having kind of found that joy again, and I also let my work in education inspire my writing, whether it's writing more stories for the future or writing
Mhm.
songs. So it kind of one feeds the other.
Mhm.
So that's kind of where I am now in life.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and it's always good to constantly evolve and find out what, helps you grow as an educator and as a human being. So, you talked a little bit about Bello the Cello, but I'd like you to choose one of your three books and highlight a little bit about just what readers can get out of the book, kind of what inspired you in making the story happen.
Yeah, so when I write, I generally kind of have a two-pronged approach as to why I write, why I create the stories that I create. One, I
Mhm.
definitely want to see students identifying with the emotions and the characters and the stories that I write. That's one
Mhm.
big purpose for me. I don't write stories that are just very like wafer thin and surface level where everything's
Mhm.
hunky and dory and like so I definitely dig into emotional conflict in my stories and make
Mhm.
it palatable, make very heavy topics palatable even for the youngest of children to kind of maybe start having that conversation about unresolved emotions that they may be carrying within themselves, say with a counselor or a parent. Um, just because I want our children to be very self-aware, and also learn those skills that they need to regulate, emotional difficulties that they may be carrying within themselves due to whatever life circumstance that they may be facing, either immediately or indirectly. So, and that's a big part of social emotional wholeness. So I definitely make sure that my stories lead children to kind of ask themselves the question, what is that feeling within me that I am feeling? Where does that feeling come from? How can I talk to a responsible grown-up about, whether it's my dad or mom or my counselor at school, about these unresolved emotions that I have within me? So that's one big reason why I write. I want children to identify with the emotions and the characters in my stories. I want them to see themselves in my story. That's one. Purpose number two as to why I write is because I want my stories to be resources for the classroom teacher, to kind of glean curriculum content, for the purposes of lesson planning and things of that nature for the classroom. So on one side, I want children to be able to see themselves in my stories, but on the other side, I want educators to feel like, man, I can really take this particular story and work off of it for a month and glean different lessons, whether that's vocabulary enrichment, whether that's critical thinking, whether that's identifying and analyzing emotions. So all of those content areas, I want my educator friends to be able to use my books and work off of it for their classroom curriculum goal purposes. So those are the kind of two reasons why I write and create, whether it's stories or songs. So coming back to now, Bello the Cello is the story that I'll kind of use to address your question. The emotional kind of conflict question in the book is, what is my life's purpose? And I feel like with Bello the Cello, we can kind of plant the seed even in the youngest of our students, as to maybe to have them start asking the question of, what are my strengths, what are my zones of power where I am my very best, and how can I start building in those areas, whether their area of strength is math, or I've got great gross motor skills and I'm good at physical tasks. Maybe I'm wired to be an athlete, and maybe that's where I can start investing my energies. Or maybe I'm into music and art. So just to kind of get our young minds to get their wheels turning in regards to where they think their strengths lie. And I don't think a child is never too young to start processing and wondering where their strengths lie as a person, as a student, as a family member. So the large question in Bello the Cello is, what is my life song? What is my life, my life's contribution to this world? That's the big $50,000 question in Bello the Cello, but it's distilled and brought down to the narrative of a little cello, wondering, where's my place in my classroom? All my friends around me seem to have their own song. The tambourine's doing his thing, the saxophone's doing his thing, the drum's doing her thing. Where do I fit in, right? And that whole, like, where do I fit in? What's my place in the world is a question that all children, heck, even grown-ups think about. And it's part of that evolving that you kind of touched on a little while ago. So that's the whole point of Bello the Cello. If you feel lost internally, wondering where's my place in this world, then I want Bello's dilemma in Bello the Cello to kind of resonate with the child that's having those same questions about, how do I find my way in this world? And then in the story, you will see that the moon, the character of the moon, and the character of Miss Melody, the teacher in the classroom, kind of have dialogue with Bello and kind of point him in the right direction. So that's another way of telling our children who have internal dilemmas about who they are and their place in this world, that you don't find your way in this world on your own. We have to walk together with people who can kind of help us in discovering who we are or point us in the right direction. So
Sure.
Bello the Cello is also about community. So it's about planting those questions in children's minds about, where do my strengths lie? What's my place in this world? How do I fit in? Which is not a bad question to ask. And then pointing children to walk in community with people that will help them discover themselves, whether that's being in the classroom of the right teacher that will help you discover who you are, where your strengths lie, whether you're good at science or math or athletics or whatever. Or, what does it look like walking alongside your family members and discovering who you are, and, finding the larger narratives of life. What's beautiful about my heritage, my culture, all of those big conversations. So that's what Bello the Cello is all about, from the perspective of the student. And then from the perspective of the educator, you talk about the arc of a story, the different facets of the characters in Bello the Cello, how Miss Melody's the encourager, and how Mr. Moon is also a facilitator when it comes to self-discovery. So for the teacher, I'm hoping that he or she can see their role as being the encourager, the facilitator to the bellows in their room. And so, I also hope teachers will bring in the synergy of Miss Melody's classroom into their classrooms and see and show children, look at how Bello's friends encouraged him. They didn't put him down, even though he didn't fit in. So bringing the chemistry and the culture of Miss Melody's classroom into their own classrooms and helping students identify those positive culture like markers for their own classrooms. And then I'm hoping that educators will collaborate with each other. So a lot of music teachers and art teachers have used Bello the Cello for doing art lessons in their room, whether that's creating the patterns, whether that's students creating the patterns that they see in Bello the Cello, whether that's music teachers doing a lesson on musical instruments, because Bello the Cello has a wide array of instruments. So from an educator standpoint, I'm hoping that educators will use it for art, use it for music, but also use it for talking about the vocabulary that kind of revolves around a positive culture in a classroom, and having that discussion, having that conversation with their students. So going back to why I write, I want students to see themselves in their books, and I want educators to be able to use the content in my stories to enhance the positive experience that students have in their classroom, both from an academic standpoint, but also from a culture building, social emotional wholeness, community building standpoint as well.
Yeah, and it sounds like you have a culture responsive piece as well in the stories, where kids can see themselves, like you said, and make aspects of the culture of Miss Melody's classroom into their own classroom. So yeah, thanks for that explanation. I wondered a little bit about getting some of the books out to kids in schools. You said that through your company that you've helped distribute to some public schools in the recent year, at least. Tell me how that takes place.
Yeah, so most schools kind of get a hold of me through my website, through my social media handles. So on Twitter, I'm Stories by Dennis. On Instagram, I'm Books by Dennis. I'm on Facebook as well. But if educators go to booksbydennis.com, that's the website for my LLC, Books by Dennis. That's where a lot of schools kind of use the contact page to get a hold of me. And since starting my authorship in 2019, like I was telling you in our kind of pre-conversation, or maybe at the outset of our conversation, I've distributed now, coming up on having some 50,000 books distributed to over 200 schools nationally, and a lot of that is through those conversations that I have with hundreds of educators on social media and through my website.
And some of that, I remember when we spoke on the pre-chat, you talked about a lot of that's you just kind of physically packing in the books and distributing them.
Yeah. So just very fortunate to kind of have a very hands-on approach. I do
Mhm.
all of that work. I, initiate or sometimes receive these, one-on-one conversations with hundreds of educators nationally. And that's a huge point of joy and honor for me that I get
Mhm.
to do that I get to speak with teachers, principals, librarians, superintendents.
Mhm.
These are our valuable educators. I mean, the greatest resource our country has.
Mhm.
It's such a statement of honor for me to say that I get to talk to hundreds of educators nationally, and I get to receive these requests from schools that say we would like 600 books of Bello, the 600 copies of Bello the Cello, or we want 1,200 copies of
Mhm.
How Grizzly Found Gratitude. And it's very humbling to say that I get to pack those books and ship them personally, as opposed to someone else doing it for me, an agent doing it for me or something. And that happens in rare occasions too, if there are
Mhm.
time
Mhm.
constraints and whatnot. But most of the time, I'm the one shipping and packing my books, so about 85 to 90%. So I'm getting ready to send about 400 books to Montana.
Mhm.
Just to give you a little insight there, because around 15 schools are coming together to have me come for a day of events at multiple school districts. They're coming together to to one location to do two big events, that kind of a thing. So yeah, it's so cool. It's not lost on me that it's so rare
Mhm.
that I get to play that role, being someone
Mhm.
who's a full-time educator currently, but is also an author, and the fact that I get to like send the work that I've created personally to educators, and who then kind of like pass it on to the students in their buildings. Yeah, I'm very fortunate
Mhm.
to be able to do that.
Mhm. Mhm. So you also do virtual visits, especially during the pandemic, and like you said, you are visiting some schools in person. But are you available for virtual visits? And how does that work? Is it usually an assembly? Is it for an individual teacher? And how long do you usually read your books for?
All of the above. At the end of the day, it's about what the school is looking for. During the
Mhm.
pandemic, those 2 years where we were kind of in the dark in so many ways, I did some 250 virtual author visits. Um,
Mhm.
and the scheduling of that, the duration of that, it all comes down to what the school is looking for. So I've done short
Mhm.
15-minute author visits. I've done virtual author visits that are an hour and 15 minutes long. So
Mhm.
I've had over 1,000 students tune in at one time onto a Zoom
Wow.
author visit. I've done virtual author visits for two kids,
Mhm.
just for two students, because and it see at the end of the day, like this is what it all comes down to: the experience of each and every child.
Mhm. Mhm.
I set up an author visit for a teacher, and her whole class was invited. They all got books, but when it was time for the actual visit, only two students tuned in, and the teacher apologized, and she was just like, "Mr. Matthew, I'm sorry." That I was like, "No way!" For these two kids that have
Yeah.
joined, right? They are getting a very personal experience, and this personal experience is all the world for them, right? It means all the world to them. And so I presented to those two kiddos like I was presenting to 1,000 kids,
Mhm.
with my energy still say the same. So at the end of the day, it's about those children and opening their eyes to the possibilities of what literature can be, what children's literature can be, what music can be. And it's also about opening their eyes to what they can possibly be in the future, right?
Mhm.
It's all about stirring their little imaginations to create, write, sing, imagine brighter futures for
Mhm.
themselves, whether that's in science or math or whatever. Because I break down my narrative for the people who attend the visits, telling them, hey, listen, I'm a school teacher. I work at a school, but I also
Mhm.
wanted to become an author. So I decided to pursue that dream. And I didn't leave my day job. I'm doing both, right? So I want children to be able to picture that for their futures too, that they can be anything they want to be if
Mhm.
they imagine and pursue those goals, and obviously work hard. I make it sure, I make sure to tell my children, my students who are watching, that there is no substitute for hard work. Like there is no
Mhm.
there are no
Mhm.
shortcuts if you want sustained results over a long period of time. So, yeah, I absolutely do virtual visits. Yes, I do.
Mhm. Well, you talked in just your last response about you are still a full-time speech language pathologist. So talk about kind of how your work as a speech pathologist has evolved into songwriting, and that you started dabbling in songwriting in high school, and like, working with language kind of has that same similarity to writing song lyrics. So you probably more of that like linguistic type brain. So talk to me about how that evolved.
So only later did I realize that my affinity for languages and accents kind of had a role to play in me ending up in the speech language pathology field,
Hmm.
where
Hmm.
you're so attuned to and so closely listening to the stories of the kiddos you treat, the students you treat. So much of therapy, speech language therapy, so much of that is about therapeutic rapport.
Yeah.
And I'm realizing that over the last 16 years that I have had boys and girls sit across from the table in small group or one-on-one sessions, telling me their stories, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, and this is hindsight's 2020. I'm realizing, my gosh, we're all walking stories, right? And
Hmm.
stories are full of language and narratives. Well, if you think about it, songs are also stories put to music, right? Narratives put to music. So 4 years into this, I realized, man, I didn't start a whole new chapter of living. It's just an extension of what I've already been doing. I've been listening to stories of hundreds of children, hundreds of boys and girls in my therapy sessions. I've
Hmm.
been listening to stories. I've been, whether it's building on language skills or working on articulation skills or working on social skills, right? I'm realizing, man, I've been working with stories for the last 16 years. Now I just happen to start, I also just happen to, have started writing stories, like creating new stories. So, and the same thing, like and now, and when you think about it, what I do is I take the lessons in my stories, then I put them to music, right? So,
Hmm.
um, so how Grizzly Found Gratitude is about gratitude. And from that kind of, I got a spark of inspiration and was kind of led to write a song about gratitude. So
Hmm.
I feel like the story writing kind of lends itself to songwriting as well, and I feel like the story writing often comes from my daily experiences with boys and girls, with students and their families, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes their narratives inspire me to create narratives for children's books. So I feel like they all kind of feed each other, which is a great place to be in life. Seeing one chapter of my life continuing, but also lending itself to subsequent chapters of my life is very cool and inspiring. So I feel like being a speech pathologist, I dwell in the realm of language constantly, the meaning of what people are saying, and the origins of those stories. So since I kind of live in that, language domain, I find it constantly inspiring me to write narratives that are rich in language.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and that's great how you can use like some of the inspiration from that many years of working with students and realizing their stories everywhere. And you also talked a little bit about like just getting your company off the ground. You started with book fairs and promoted on social media. So how have you basically through those things gained a lot of schools that want to bring you in and buy your books? Has it just been a slow and steady pace, or did it explode kind of during the pandemic?
I will say, I had to do a lot of legwork, like a lot of like upfront, sweat equity, so to speak. I had to
Yeah.
sow in, at the very outset. And I will say the pandemic and schools looking for virtual alternatives to having speakers and presenters in their building, like that that need that schools had kind
Mhm.
of was fuel on the fire that I had kind of started in the very beginning. So the pandemic really did amplify these virtual experiences, which kind of facilitated mass distributions of books, because I don't charge schools for my visits. I don't charge school for my presentations. So my presentations are completely free. What schools compensate me with or pay me with are these massive book purchases for their students. And so when schools purchase these books in large quantities, they get large discounts on the books as well. So it's a big, win-win for the schools. I mean, they're getting a free presenter, and they're getting books for the kids. Their kids get to walk away from the experience with a tangible book in their hand. So yes, the 2-year window of the pandemic, where schools were shut down, that kind of did like amplify the work, the prep that I had put into like getting this thing off the ground. I will also say it is a marathon. I mean, you do one visit, you make sure you do your very best for that school, and then word gets around. Hey, we had a visitor, we had a presenter, and it was really good. We highly recommend that you guys get Dennis for your school. Like, so there is a trickle, effect. Kind of like you put a pebble in a pond. I mean, those ripples kind of go out, right? So there is an organic kind of marketing, spreading of the word, so to speak, that happens when you do these good events. And sometimes I'll tell you, I mean, this is pretty normal to keep up with a school district or a school for a year and a half, 2 years, till something pans out, because there's a lot of funding and logistics issues that need to fall in line for an author visit, a literacy event to happen. So it's very normal for me to follow up with multiple schools at the same time for a period of a year and a half, 2 years, to kind of see something actually come to pass. Which is where a lot of like first-time authors kind of lose heart, because they send an email, they send another email, they call, leave a voicemail, and just the not hearing back from whoever they're trying to reach to, that can be discouraging. But I made it a point to not just wait on one school to respond to me. So what I do is I reach out to a bunch of schools, and it's almost like when finally I get that call back, it's like a surprise, and I was like, oh yeah, I've been waiting to hear from you. So I like those, those return calls or those return emails that come out of the blue, because I wasn't sitting there waiting on it. I kept on working, right? And I just waited for the school to respond when they were ready. And sometimes it's just a matter of like, okay, Dennis reached out to us, but as we take time to decide if we want to move on Dennis, we see Dennis moving on and having positive results in other schools and other districts, which is more motivation for these schools that are waiting to get back with me to respond to that email or pick up the phone and call me finally or whatever. You know what I mean? Yeah. So but it's ultimately the children who are receiving the benefit of all this. The fact that I can say 50,000 books will have been distributed to some 250 schools come September or October, right? We'll hit that 50,000 target here pretty soon. Man, a lot of those books, a good chunk, 95% maybe, those books are bought with state and federally allocated funds that schools have to use to buy resources for students. So those 50,000 books, a big chunk of that, went to students without those families having to spend a penny. And so, with the inflation thing going on, and with the pandemic, so many families didn't have jobs, right? So many families were financially struggling. In the middle of all that, it is very humbling, and it brings me a lot of joy to say, even in the midst of that, we were able to get books to kids. And so that brings me a lot of joy and honor to be able to say that.
Yeah. And like you're kind of like that textbook for hard work, and perseverance pays off.
Yeah. And I always tell my aspiring authors, like, don't be a vendor. Genuinely care about the people who you connect with, especially educators. Educators have one of the hardest jobs in the world. And so when you reach out to schools, reach out to educators, don't come across as a vendor who just wants to sell a product. Genuinely man, we talk about this in regards to the classroom, making those authentic connections with our students. Well, that applies to grown-up human beings too. Like, genuinely want to authentically connect with the educator that you're reaching out to, and promoting your book with or whatever. Like, so for me, when I connect with educators, I let that relationship grow over the course of years, where I want to get to know that educator and how long they've been in education, and what's been the high point and the low point in education. And I'll tell you what, in the last 3 to 4 years, there have been many instances where I'll visit a state because a school has organized to visit. And that principal or that teacher, will invite me, my wife, my daughter over to their home, and we'll have dinner. And my daughter will get to meet their kids, and their kids get to meet my daughter, and I get to meet, Miss So-and-so's husband or Mr. So-and-so's wife. Like, that's been a beautiful thing to watch over the last 3 to 4 years, where I have now built genuine, authentic friendships where I'm, the educator's family is now friends of my family. Does that make sense? So it's cool to see how writing stories for children has evolved into that, where educators in states around the country are now family friends of ours. And so I always encourage aspiring authors, aspiring educator authors to work for the long haul, like plant seeds for the long term, right? To build authentic, genuine relationships, friendships, connections with the educators they reach out to.
Yeah, that's such a great thing to remember. Well, we had a great conversation today on what got you started in writing and music, and your work with both of the careers that you have. Out of everything we talked about, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
That they have a story to tell. That every single person listening has a story to tell. That it's great to admire someone else's story. It's really great to be inspired by listening to someone else's story. But then we've got to go a step deeper and ask ourselves introspectively, man, I have a story. What story do I carry within me that the world needs to hear about? We're all walking stories. So, when a man or a woman lives to be 80, 90, whatever, over those 8 decades, they have accumulated a wealth of narratives and wealth of stories. And it's a gift to the world to put those narratives and stories out there, so the world will know how, everyday people encountered and overcame challenges, and how, how their narratives can inspire the ongoing, evolving human experience. So my encouragement to listeners is, thank you for listening. But now you got a story to tell. Get that story on paper, on a tablet, on a computer screen, get it out to the world.
Yeah, that's a great message. Where can people connect with you and find you online?
So booksbydennis.com is a great, one-stop kind of place to kind of see what I do. Also a great way to get a hold of me. But then Twitter, that's where a lot of educators connect with me. Stories by Dennis is my handle. Instagram's another great place, Books by Dennis. And then Facebook is where I connect with thousands of educators. So just look up Dennis Matthew on Facebook. That's Matthew with 1 T, no S at the end. You'll see a picture of me, my beautiful wife, and my beautiful daughter. And then feel free to message me or reach out or add me on Facebook. So those are all great ways. But the website's always a great place to start.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being my guest on the Out of the Trenches podcast today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. We finally made it happen. Thank you.